He called himself the Zodiac, a killer who turned murder into a game. His victims were random, his letters were cryptic, and his taunts drove police to obsession. More than 50 years later, the world still asks the same haunting question. Who was the Zodiac killer? On a cold December night in 1968, the quiet back roads of Benicia, California, were supposed to be a place for teenagers to escape, to park their cars, play music, and dream about the future. But for 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, that night would mark the beginning of one of America's most terrifying crime sprees. Shortly after 11 p.m., the Rambler station wagon was found on a gravel turnout along Lake Herman Road, the doors open, the headlights still on. Both teenagers had been shot. Betty Lou lay lifeless a few feet from the car, 5 bullets in her back. David, barely alive, was slumped by the rear wheel, a single shot to the head. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, no motive, only cold precision. The police were baffled. Rural killings were rare in Solano County, and there were no witnesses, no shell casings that led to anything useful. It was a brutal, senseless act that felt almost surgical. No one knew it then, but the killer had just made his first move in a twisted game that would haunt Northern California for decades. 7 months later, he struck again. It was the 4th of July weekend, 1969, the kind of warm summer night when Vallejo buzzed with fireworks and laughter. At Blue Rock Springs Park, Darlene Farron, a 22-year-old waitress, sat in her car with her friend, Michael Mageau. Around midnight, another car pulled up beside them, its headlights blinding. The driver stepped out, approached with a flashlight, and opened fire. Bullets ripped through the car windows. Darlene was struck multiple times. Michael was hit in the jaw, leg, and chest, but somehow survived. Then, less than an hour later, the Vallejo Police Department received a call. A calm male voice said, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." The caller then hung up. The phone booth was found just blocks from the police station. For the first time, the killer had spoken and taken credit for 2 separate shootings. Investigators realized they were dealing with someone unlike any criminal they'd encountered before. A murderer who wanted to be known. A man desperate to be seen and heard. Detectives compared the shell casings from both scenes. They matched. The same weapon had been used. But there was something else. The methodical way the killer stalked his victims. The calculated calm of his voice. The deliberate decision to contact police. This was not a random spree. It was a campaign of terror. In the days that followed, the story exploded across California newspapers. "Double murder in Vallejo," one headline read. The public was terrified, but the police had no leads. Then, on August 1st, 1969, 3 letters arrived at the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald. Each one was written in the same, slanted handwriting. The letters began with the same introduction. "Dear Editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo." Each letter also contained 1/3 of a cryptogram, a mysterious cipher made up of strange symbols, circles, and triangles. The writer demanded that the papers print the codes on the front page, threatening that if they didn't, he would cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night. The message was clear. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who wanted control over the police, over the media, and over public fear. The editors debated what to do. In the end, the San Francisco Chronicle published its portion of the cipher, and the others followed. Overnight, Northern California descended into panic. Every household, it seemed, had a copy of the newspaper spread across the kitchen table, trying to solve the strange code. Teachers, students, even cryptographers from the Navy pored over the symbols, desperate to uncover the killer's message. Then, on August 8th, a schoolteacher and his wife from Salinas broke the cipher. The message sent chills through the nation. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. It gives me the most thrilling experience. The letter ended with a promise that his identity was hidden within the code. But it wasn't. There was no name, only madness disguised as logic. By now he had given himself a name, the Zodiac. The symbol he chose, a circle with a cross through it, would soon become one of the most feared icons in America. In the months that followed, police patrols increased, curfews were discussed, and the press fed on every new rumor. But while the public panicked, the Zodiac thrived on attention. He had achieved what he wanted most: notoriety. He wasn't just killing people anymore. He was killing peace of mind. From that point on, his crimes became messages, theatrical performances designed for maximum terror. And Northern California, once a place of sunsets and quiet suburbs, found itself living under the shadow of a killer who viewed murder not as a crime, but as a game. By the autumn of 1969, the Zodiac killer was no longer just a murderer. He was a media phenomenon. Every newspaper in Northern California ran his cryptic letters, his hand-drawn crosshair symbol printed for millions to see. He had forced his way into the public consciousness, using fear as his weapon and attention as his reward. For him, every headline was another victory. The killings continued, each more brazen than the last. On the night of September 27th, two college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing by the shores of Lake Berryessa. The sun was bright, the air still. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Then, out of the silence, a man appeared. He wore a black hood with white crosshairs drawn across the chest, the mark of the Zodiac. At first he claimed he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money to flee to Mexico, but his calm tone didn't match his words. As Brian handed over his wallet, the stranger pulled out a knife and bound them both with pre-cut clothesline cords. Moments later, he began stabbing them, methodically, relentlessly. Brian was stabbed 6 times, Cecilia more than 10. Then, before walking away, the killer took out a felt-tip pen and wrote on the car door, Vallejo 12-20-68, 7-4-69, September 27-69, 6:30, by knife. It was his signature, part confession, part performance. Cecilia died 2 days later. Brian survived, providing one of the only first-hand descriptions of the Zodiac. A tall man in his late 20s or 30s, wearing heavy-rimmed glasses, calm, polite, and eerily composed. But the killer wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, he struck again, this time in San Francisco. On the night of October 11th, cab driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger near the theater district. The man gave an address in Presidio Heights, one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. When the cab stopped, the passenger drew a pistol and shot Stein point-blank in the head. Then, with grotesque precision, He tore off a piece of the driver's bloody shirt and walked away. 3 teenagers across the street witnessed everything and immediately called the police. Within minutes, patrol officers arrived, but a fatal mistake was made. The dispatcher, believing the suspect was a black male, relayed the wrong description. So when officers passed a white man in his 30s walking calmly down the street, they let him go. That man almost certainly was the Zodiac. The following day, the San Francisco Chronicle received yet another letter. This one contained the stolen piece of Paul Stein's shirt, proof that the writer was indeed the killer. In the letter, the Zodiac bragged about how easily he had escaped. "The police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly," he taunted. "Instead, they let me walk right past them." The letter also included a terrifying new threat. He would target school buses next. "I shall shoot out the tires of a school bus," he wrote, "and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." Those words plunged the Bay Area into chaos. Parents refused to send their children to school. Buses drove under armed escort. Every police officer in San Francisco was on edge. The killer had found a way to hold an entire city hostage. Not through violence alone, but through fear. Then came the ciphers. More letters arrived over the next months. Strange diagrams, coded messages, and delusional ramblings about collecting slaves for the afterlife. Each note was signed with the familiar crosshair symbol, and often included his tally, the number of people he claimed to have killed. "I have killed 7, one letter read, "but I shall increase that number soon." The handwriting was always the same, deliberate, confident, almost proud. He enjoyed the performance, the back and forth with police and journalists. For him, murder was only one part of the game. The other part was control. Psychologists later described his communication style as narcissistic terrorism, a method of feeding on fear and recognition. He wasn't content with anonymity. He wanted to be immortal. Each time the press published one of his letters, he achieved exactly that. As investigators scrambled, different agencies, Vallejo, Napa, San Francisco, and the FBI, struggled to coordinate. Leads were lost in bureaucracy. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions. And while the Zodiac's handwriting and spelling quirks offered clues, they weren't enough to identify him. The killer seemed to know this. In one letter, he mocked the police directly. "If you cops think I'm going to tell you my name, you're crazy. You'll have me then. You won't get me this time." He even wrote to talk show hosts, offering to call in live if a prominent lawyer appeared on television. When the program aired, several viewers phoned in claiming to be the Zodiac, but whether the real killer called remains uncertain. By early 1970, his crimes had stopped, or at least, his letters suggested they had. Some experts believe the Zodiac continued killing under different guises. Others think he simply grew tired of the game once the thrill of public attention faded. But his correspondence continued sporadically for years, each new note reigniting public fear. For detectives, it was like chasing a ghost who not only stayed one step ahead, but also mocked them for following. Every time they thought the trail had gone cold, another letter arrived, like a voice from the shadows, reminding them that the game wasn't over. The Zodiac had mastered something few killers ever did. He made the world his stage. The murders were acts of violence, but the letters, they were theater. He was both the author and the villain, directing a story that the entire nation couldn't stop reading. And as the body count rose and the ciphers grew stranger, one thing became clear. This wasn't about revenge, money, or even blood. It was about power. The power to terrify, to control, to be remembered. The Zodiac didn't just kill his victims. He killed the illusion of safety and made America afraid of the dark. For decades, detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths have obsessed over the question that still haunts California's history. Who was the Zodiac killer? He was never caught, never identified, and never confirmed dead. He simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of bodies, ciphers, and terror that stretched across time like an open wound. Over the years, dozens of names have surfaced, each one promising to end the mystery. But none have. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a former schoolteacher from Vallejo. Allen had a disturbing past, expelled for inappropriate behavior with students, obsessed with weapons, and known for violent fantasies. He lived near several Zodiac crime scenes and even told acquaintances that he wanted to call himself the Zodiac. When police searched his home, they found bloody knives, homemade bombs, and a typewriter similar to the one used in some of the letters. Investigators thought they had their man, but Allen's fingerprints didn't match the partial prints from the Zodiac's letters, and his handwriting, though similar, wasn't a definitive match. DNA samples taken later from envelopes attributed to the killer ruled him out entirely. He died in 1992, officially uncharged but forever branded by public suspicion. Then came Lawrence Kane, a real estate agent with a brain injury that impaired his emotional control. He resembled the composite sketches, lived near one of the victims, and even shared a workplace with a woman who had been stalked by a man resembling the Zodiac. But again, no hard evidence. Another theory pointed to Earl Van Best Jr., proposed decades later by his own son, who claimed his father's handwriting matched the Zodiac's, and that his photo bore a striking resemblance to the police sketch. The story made headlines, but forensic experts dismissed it. The similarities were superficial, the proof circumstantial. Dozens more suspects followed: police officers, cryptographers, journalists, even a secret group within the military. The Zodiac had become more than a man. He was an idea, a dark mirror reflecting society's fascination with unsolved evil. The investigation itself revealed as much about law enforcement as it did about the killer. At the time, cooperation between different police departments was minimal. Each county kept its own records, rarely sharing with others. Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco detectives often pursued their own leads, unaware that other agencies were chasing the same ghost. The lack of coordination allowed the Zodiac to thrive, slipping through the cracks of bureaucracy as easily as he slipped through the shadows. And then there were the letters. Over 24 were received, some authentic, others likely hoaxes. Each contained new boasts, new taunts, and new claims of murders no one could verify. The handwriting was often identical, bold, angular, deliberate. But over time, analysts began to suspect imitators. Some letters appeared to come from copycats seeking attention. Others were too erratic, too different in tone. It became impossible to tell where the real Zodiac ended and the myth began. Technology, too, failed to close the case. DNA testing on saliva from the stamps in envelopes revealed only partial profiles. The few samples that existed were degraded, contaminated, or inconclusive. In the early 2000s, the San Francisco Police Department quietly closed its active investigation, though it remains technically unsolved. Yet every few years, the Zodiac returns, not in letters but in theories. In 2021, a group of independent investigators calling themselves the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the killer as Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran who died in 2018. They pointed to facial scars, cryptic evidence, and alleged military connections, but law enforcement quickly refuted the claim, saying the evidence was purely circumstantial. The legend, it seemed, would live on. For criminal profilers, the Zodiac represents the archetype of the intelligent predator, a man driven less by impulse and more by ego. His crimes were not about sexual gratification or rage, but about control and recognition. He wanted to play God, to decide who lived, who died, and who got to know his name. What makes the Zodiac so terrifying is not just his violence, but his intellect. He understood the power of media long before the digital age. He weaponized newspapers, turning headlines into his stage. Every letter he wrote manipulated the public, feeding their fear while mocking their obsession. He turned the police into characters in his story, and the world became his audience. The cultural impact was immense. The case inspired films, novels, and conspiracy theories. From Dirty Harry to Zodiac by David Fincher, his shadow looms over pop culture, the faceless killer who wrote his own mythology. Even now, online forums are filled with thousands of amateur detectives analyzing his codes, convinced they can solve what the FBI could not. But perhaps the real secret of the Zodiac's immortality lies in his anonymity. He knew that as long as his name remained hidden, he would never truly die. His letters said it best. I am waiting for a good movie about me. I am not afraid because I know I will never be caught. Half a century later, he's been proven right. The case remains open, files collecting dust in evidence rooms across California. The circle and cross symbol, once scrawled in blood and ink, has become part of the nation's dark folklore. To this day, people still claim to have seen him, to have known him, to have decoded his final message. But the truth is simpler and far more haunting. The Zodiac wasn't just one man. He was every fear we have of the unknown, every shadow we imagine following us home at night. He was the embodiment of control through chaos, a killer who needed no face to be remembered. And somewhere in the silence of California's backroads, beneath the weight of unsolved crimes and unanswered letters, his voice still echoes in the collective mind. This is the Zodiac speaking.